Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Nina Mishra. My guest today is Jay Jacobs, Head of Research and Strategy at GlobalX. GlobalX is well known for its suite of 17 very interesting thematic ETFs and a fund of funds. We are talking about the best thematic ETFs for 2020 today. Welcome back on the show, Jay.
Great to be here.
Okay, excellent. So I wanted to start with your cloud computing ETF because it is such a popular theme. Cloud is fast emerging as the new model of computing because so many companies now prefer to rely on cloud-based service providers for highly specialized computing services so that they can focus on their core businesses. And according to Gartner, cloud computing revenue soared 246% in the past decade, and those revenues are expected to grow by another 30% before 2023. You launched the GlobalX Cloud Computing ETF, ticker symbol CLOU, CLOU, in April last year. And in fact, it was one of the most successful launches of 2019. It has already gathered about 460 million in assets. So tell us about this ETF and about its potential.
Sure. So thanks for having me and excited to talk about thematic investing with you today. When we look at cloud, our cloud computing ETF, it really came as an idea from clients who, were very high on the idea of investing in cloud computing, but wanted very pure play exposure to this space. Mm-hmm. This can be a bit of a challenge because if you look at some of the biggest cloud providers, think about Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google Cloud, they're not pure plays. They have a lot of exposure to cloud, but it's still oftentimes a minority of their actual revenue.
Right.
So in designing this ETF, we really looked at how can we get more pure play exposure, more weighting tilted towards the companies that are deriving, north of 50% of their revenue from cloud computing segments. Mm-hmm. That was the way we designed it. Now, how we defined cloud computing segments really came from 5 different definitions. The first is infrastructure as a service. That's, exactly as I was just talking about, the companies like Amazon and Google that provide that scalable computing power and storage. We include platform as a service, which allows people to develop applications in the cloud. We include software as a service, which is probably the largest segment, and that includes think about companies like Workday or Salesforce, where you're getting a software delivered over the web rather than downloaded and installed onto a desktop. We also include edge and cloud hardware, the people that are making the components that power the cloud. And lastly, we're including data center REITs, the physical locations that are storing all of the cloud. The cloud has to be somewhere. It's not actually in the cloud, so the physical areas where it's being kept. So those 5 segments in combination are what we're looking at in the ETF. And we believe that by including companies from those segments, we can get very targeted exposure to the cloud theme.
Yes, as you mentioned, that this has been very popular with investors because it provides more pure play exposure to cloud computing. And I'm looking at the top holdings: Shopify, Paycom, Zscaler. These are the top holdings in this ETF, whereas the older cloud computing ETF, your competitor, and that has Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet as its top holdings. Now, while these companies are leaders in the cloud computing business, cloud computing is not their, they are not pure play cloud computing companies, and you get exposure to Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet in your S&P 500 or any other broad market ETF too. So that's why CLOU has been so popular, and it has in fact done very well too. Now, the next one which I wanted to talk about is your Internet of Things ETF, ticker symbol sensor, SNSR. And Internet of Things has also received a lot of attention in the past few years because obviously there's a growing appetite for smart connected devices. And in a recent issue, The Economist said that one forecast is that by 2035, the world will have 1 trillion connected computers built into everything from food packaging to bridges and clothes. So tell us about this ETF. And I noticed that it has done very well in the last year or so. So tell us the reasons about this strong performance.
Sure. So the Internet of Things is really the idea of connecting ordinary, everyday devices to the Internet. So you could think about something as simple as a light bulb. For 200 years, a light bulb got a little bit better technologically as we moved from kind of traditional approaches to compact fluorescence and LEDs. It lasted longer, used less energy, but nothing really changed about the light bulb over those 200 years. Right. It wasn't until the last decade, in 2012, when Philips came out with the Hue light bulb, that they suddenly were connected to the internet, and that meant that the use cases for light bulbs greatly expanded. You could program a light to turn on or turn off at a certain time. You could control it remotely from your phone. You could connect it to a sensor that would tell if somebody walked in the room and turn on the light bulb. You could get data from that light bulb about your usage to understand, are you using too much energy? Are there other practices you could implement to be more efficient? How much life is left in this light bulb? Suddenly it becomes a very smart device. That's really the idea behind the Internet of Things, is if you connect via chips different devices to the Internet, you can start to collect and receive data from them. And of course, we see this increasingly in our smart homes with smart lights, smart blinds, smart speakers, smart TVs, smart appliances. But it's also extending far beyond just our home lives. It's extending into the infrastructure around us as cities get smarter with smart grids and roadways that are being fitted with sensors to have more response to traffic patterns. And it's also extending into commercial applications as well. The smart factory, the connected factory that will utilize sensors to conduct predictive maintenance, to improve efficiency, to avoid downtime. Basically, everything is going to be connected to the Internet, and that's why we see the Internet of Things as such an essential theme for the next decade.
So, talking about Internet of Things and connected devices, they all have chips embedded in them, and they're connected to the Internet. So that is why the ETF has a lot of exposure to semiconductors, and semiconductors was, in fact, one of the top performing subsectors last year. And is that the reason why Sensor did so well last year?
Yeah, so Sensor has 3 different segments that it invests in, what we kind of consider the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. So the upstream are the semiconductor producers that are making those chips that connect devices to the Internet, the Wi-Fi chips, the 5G and 4G chips, the Bluetooth chips. And that segment did fantastically well last year, partly because it was so beaten down in 2018 in December. And people were worried about the U.S.-China trade wars and what that would do to semiconductors, and it turned out it didn't have as negative as an impact as expected. So semis did well, but the other segments we also look at network service providers. That's what we consider the midstream, those service providers that are connecting devices to the Internet, either through custom or public networks. And then last, we look at the end device manufacturers, the people creating the wearables that are connected to the Internet and the smart home devices. That's what we kind of consider that end consumer application of the Internet of Things.
And so I'm looking at some of the top holdings: Skyworks Solutions, STM, Cry Electronics, Dexcom, Garmin. These are the top holdings in this ETF. And one thing which I read is that 5G the rollout of 5G will have a major impact on Internet of Things. So tell us why investors should look at this ETF now, as major telecom companies are starting 5G rollout.
Sure. So I think there's two trends that people should be keeping an eye on. And the first one is it's just getting cheaper to connect things to the internet.
Right.
So if you do the math, there are a lot of chips out there that cost about 10 cents to connect things to the internet. So do we need a connected toaster? I don't know, but it will probably be connected to the internet because it can be. So the falling costs are making more and more devices connected to the internet. But the other reason is the increased capacity and speed of the networks themselves. So if someone has ever been in a very crowded area like a sports stadium and it looks like they have signal but they're unable to use the web on their phone or unable to place a call, that's a capacity issue. And there's a lot of 4G infrastructure that simply can't handle very high density of connected devices. When we look at 5G, the capacity can be as much as 100 times higher. In fact, they're trying to work towards a standard that would be able to connect 1 million devices per square kilometer. So that's a lot of devices all connected together. That simply doesn't work in today's infrastructure, but for the next generation, that 5G, we're going to be able to have a lot more devices operating a lot faster on those networks, which will further grow the Internet of Things.
Now, let's take a look at your video games and esports ETF. The ticker symbol is excellent, Hero. Now, this is a very new ETF. This launched in October last year. And in fact, there are 3 other ETFs that are focused on video games and esports. So tell us why you decided to launch this 4th ETF.
Sure. So, we just see this as a very powerful theme that is really starting to accelerate heading into the next decade as well. So the video game industry is not new by any stretch. A lot of these companies have been around since, the 80s, even the 70s. But we think we're really entering the next phase of the video games and esports space. So one of the reasons is we're going to see a massive upgrade cycle this year. Xbox Series X is coming out, the new generation console. PlayStation 5 is coming out this year, Sony's new console. And we're also seeing completely new business models entering the space. So, the previous model was kind of like the Hollywood model, where you would spend a lot of money up front developing a game, or in Hollywood's case, a movie, and you would sell kind of the license to that game. You would sell the CD, and people would install it. They'd pay their $60, and they could play it an unlimited amount of times. And the problem with that model is that it doesn't do a good job of segmenting the casual gamers from the high-intensity gamers. And in an ideal business model, you would be continuing to collect revenue from those high-intensity gamers. So with the new business model that we're seeing is they're trying to capture more of that economics. Part of that is through in-game advertising, which, of course, the more someone plays, the more advertising they would receive. So that's one way to monetize a rabid base. The second is through in-game purchases, so purchasing, character upgrades, kits, new levels, season passes. That's another way to monetize those hardcore gamers. And then the third way we're seeing is through streaming services. The fact that technology has gotten good enough that you might not need a console at all. Right. You could purely just stream games, either on mobile through Apple's Arcade or through your TV through Google Stadia. But the idea is to kind of turn gaming into a Netflix-like recurring revenue model rather than one-off sales.
So how is the ETF different from its competitors?
Well, our focus, of course, is always going to be focusing on the pure plays. Okay. We've been doing thematic investing for about 10 years now. Our first thematic ETF was our lithium and battery tech ETF, which we launched in 2010. So our priority is always constructing a product that has good pure play exposure to a specific theme and also evolves with the theme as it begins to change. So not only are we looking for companies that derive more than 50% of their revenue from something like video games and esports, but we also market cap weight our thematic ETFs because we want more exposure to the bigger names that are dominating an industry. If those names continue to grow, we'll get more exposure. If those companies start to fade, they will lose exposure. But we want to reflect the evolving nature of that theme because we think ultimately, these themes become industries and these industries become sectors as they begin to evolve, and we want to evolve with it.
And so I'm looking at the holdings. NVIDIA is the top holding, and we see a bunch of, video game makers too, Electronic Arts, Activision, Blizzard. And this has a lot of international focus too, and that makes a lot of sense considering the popularity of video gaming and esports in Japan and China. So US gets about 30% weight in the ETF, and then Japan at about 29%, and China at about 19%. Now, let's take a look at an ETF which is slightly different from these three. It is the Global X US Infrastructure Development ETF, ticker symbol PAVE. Now, this is an area which saw some bipartisan, agreement. In fact, in April last year, President Trump and Democrats had agreed to pursue a $2 trillion infrastructure plan, but not much has happened since then. And it seems that now that impeachment has moved on to the Senate, there may be something in the House on the infrastructure legislation. So tell us about this ETF and why investors should look at this now.
Sure. Yeah, we launched this product early after Trump's original election. Not in response to Trump in particular, but more in response to the campaign trail, where we realized, one, all of the data shows that U.S. infrastructure is just bad. It's been underinvested in. There's a huge funding gap, and it's starting to deteriorate and not being adapted to the 21st century. But two, and really the reason why we felt like the time is now for infrastructure, is that it's a rare case of bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats both support infrastructure spending. And therefore, we think, of anything that's going to be, very policy-driven, infrastructure, stands one of the best chances of seeing actual political support. Now, if we fast forward to today, why do we think PAVE is a good investment for 2020? We are back in an election cycle. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of candidates lining up and coming out with infrastructure plans.
Right.
And I honestly think there's going to be some serious one-upmanship in those plans. Is it a $1 trillion plan like Trump presented? Is it a $1.3 trillion plan like Biden presented? Is the next candidate going to come out with a $1.5 trillion plan? I think that's what we're going to see, because it's a very popular policy among people's constituents. And therefore, I think we're just going to see more is better in a lot of these plans that are being offered. Now, I do have to say, there's a lot more nuance than just how much money is going to be poured into this space, because it's not just a function of, is it $1 trillion or $1.3 trillion that the federal government is going to put behind infrastructure. A lot of it's going to be, how is it implemented? Is it being appropriately used to, reflect changing consumer habits, to reflect urbanization, to reflect the inevitability of electric and autonomous vehicles. But overall, we do think that as we enter into this election cycle, there's going to be more and more attention on infrastructure and federal support for it.
Okay, very interesting. So tell us how holdings are selected and weighted in the ETF.
Yeah, so we're looking at a few different segments that we think will stand to benefit from an increased spending in infrastructure. So the first segment we look at is construction and engineering companies that are primarily involved in infrastructure. We look at key components of infrastructure on the materials side, components like cement and steel. We look at heavy machinery leasing companies, the machines that will be used to build infrastructure, as well as some of the transports that are moving the machinery and materials around the country. So it's a fairly broad index. It's still market cap weighted, but because it has north of 80 holdings, that keeps it a bit more broad than some of our other themes that may have 35 to 40 holdings. But another key requirement is all of the holdings have to get 50% or more of their revenue from the United States. We really see this as a country-specific issue, and we want to make sure that it's very targeted from that perspective.
Very interesting. Now, I wanted to talk about the new ETF, another new ETF that you launched in October last year, and this is a fund of funds. So all the thematic ETFs that we discussed and other thematic ETFs that you offer, they all have a lot of long-term growth potential, but they are generally more volatile than, say, broad technology ETF or broad market ETF because of their narrow focus. And some of the themes are quite cyclical too. So this ETF provides additional diversification by holding a bunch of those high growth but volatile ETFs. So tell us why you decided to launch GXTG and why investors should look at this ETF rather than just holding a bunch of other thematic ETFs.
Well, you hit on a few of the key points there, and one is, some people want to have more diversified exposure to thematic investing. So they like the individual themes, but they want to hold a few of them to diversify which themes are going to be driving those returns. But because thematic investing is a little bit newer than some other investment strategies, some investors are just not comfortable picking and weighting their own themes. So they came to us with the request to create a fund-to-funds approach that picks those themes and weights them in a way that makes sense, but also kind of offloads the responsibility of picking and weighting them so that the investor can just buy one ticker that gets that broad exposure to thematic investing. So that was really how we approached the space. How could we create a one-ticker solution that gives people diversified exposure to multiple themes? Another thing that we thought about was how to get really kind of higher growth exposure within that ETF. So we select ETFs and rank and weight them based off of their 12-month revenue growth. So we're kind of growth weighting the themes that we have exposure to kind of tilt the exposure to be even more growthy.
Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at the top holdings now. Your social media ETF is currently the top holding in GXTG with about 25% allocation. And then you have the e-commerce ETF, eBiz, FinTech ETF, FINX, and the Internet of Things ETF, the Robotics and AI ETF, BOTS, Lithium and Battery ETF, ticker symbol LIT, and then a Longevity Thematic ETF, ticker symbol LNGR. Another thing which I liked about this ETF is that it charges just 50 basis points in expenses, which is actually cheaper than some of the underlying expense ratios of some of the underlying ETFs. So tell us about the expense ratio. Why did you decide to price it at 50 basis points?
Yeah, that was exactly one of the key factors we were thinking about when creating this ETF. We really see thematic investing as a core part of one's portfolio. That many growth-oriented portfolios, frankly, are going to struggle over the next decade to achieve growth. We have high valuations. We're coming out of a decade of fantastic returns. They're likely to be muted going forward. Mm-hmm. And so one way for people to improve the growth profiles of those more aggressive portfolios is to include exposure to thematic investing and to these disruptive trends that are likely to experience kind of market-beating growth over that time frame. So we see our diversified thematic offering, GXTG, is really a core part of those more aggressive portfolios and trying to give more growth characteristics to the overall portfolio. So because we see it as kind of one of these essential building blocks, we did want to give it a compelling management fee as well, given that it's going to likely occupy a larger portion of one's portfolio.
Okay, makes sense. Very interesting. That's all we have time for today. Jay, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about these ETFs, please visit globalxetfs.com. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next edition of ETF Spotlight and also make sure to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.